Greetings. In the last mini lecture, which was the 11th mini lecture on the Constitution, we were really getting to what I consider really exciting material. We have people at the convention, delegates who are representing different interests. They don't fundamentally trust one another. And what they find is that they cannot impose power over the other. And my definition of power is quite simple. Power is the ability to get someone to do something they wouldn't otherwise do. I started talking about the first issue, which was representation. And of course, the large states were trying to get their way to represent representation on population. The small states where they're trying to get representation based on geography. Neither could impose their will. What I didn't mention, because I was at the end of the lecture last time, was this issue was so divisive that it nearly broke up the convention. There were delegates actually packing up, thinking that if we can't resolve this issue over representation, we can't resolve anything else, and this constitutional convention is going to be a failure. But there was a compromise, the Connecticut or Great Compromise, and essentially both sides were given one institution to dominate. Obviously, the Senate is the small state chamber, and the House is the large state chamber. But what makes it work, and the formal name for this is bicameral equality or bicameralism. I call it the insurance clause. And the insurance is that both sides are guaranteed a veto or a check over the other chamber. As I told you earlier, if the House tries to pass a measure that will hurt the interest of the small states, they refuse to pass it, and vice versa. In today's lecture, I want to talk about the Electoral College. And I'm going to talk about it in a lot more detail when we get to the presidency, but I want to talk about it in the abstract, because if some of you have read ahead and you've read through chapter 2 in Greenberg, you realize that the Electoral College was not actually part of the Great Compromise. So the obvious question is, well, what's wrong with Randall? Why does Randall have the Electoral College as D here? He's an idiot. No, I do this because even though the Electoral College was resolved later than the Connecticut Compromise, I want you to see that this logic that we see in the Great Compromise, that in the United States we are going to represent both our people and our states, is something that is carried over with the Electoral College. I have a lot of friends of mine who talk to me and say, how and why do we have this Electoral College? You teach this stuff. And I said, well, if you're looking through the eyes of 2020, the Electoral College may or may not make sense. And I actually think I can make an equal case for keeping it or for abandoning it. But think about 1787. There was a real dispute over who should choose the president. Some people, like my favorite delegate, Benjamin Franklin, was way out of his league at this convention. Most of the delegates were very conservative. Benjamin Franklin wanted direct election of the president, which is something we're hearing today in 2020. That was his idea in 1787, and they said, Ben, go sit in the corner. Benjamin Franklin also wanted to abolish slavery. It was the last great crusade of his life, and once again, he was told, go sit in the corner. There were others who wanted the president to be chosen by state legislatures. And that failed because I told you that originally senators were chosen by state legislators. And so if the state legislature got to choose both the senators and the president, it would probably be more prestigious and powerful to be a state legislator than to be in the national government. Some people wanted the president to be chosen by the Congress. sort of like in Great Britain, right, where the prime minister is selected by the House of Commons. The argument was that would violate separation of powers, and how can a president be truly independent of the Congress if the Congress is selecting him? And so the Electoral College became another compromise. And essentially, the thinking was that if we have based our political system on representing both people and states, doesn't it make sense? Isn't it logical that when we elect our president, we would also represent both our people and our states? In other words, every state should have a stake in electing the president that is equal to their total congressional delegation in Congress. And so if you look at your notes, in presidential elections, the Electoral College vote for a state is equal to their total congressional delegation. So look up on the page, and I pointed out that California currently has 53 House members, and we have 2 senators. So we have 55 total electoral votes. If you scroll up in your notes, you see that Wyoming has 1 House member and 2 senators. So their total congressional delegation is 3, and as a result, Wyoming has 3 electoral votes. Now, I'm not telling you that the senators and the House members are the electors. That is specifically forbidden, and they can't be. But what I'm telling you is I find it interesting. And I will admit up front, the candidate that I voted for in 2016 won the popular vote but lost in the Electoral College. The candidate that I voted for in 2000 won the popular vote and lost in the Electoral College. So I'll give you full disclosure and tell you that my candidates lost. But if we're analyzing the Electoral College, the U.S. Senate is actually far less democratic than the Electoral College. I told you earlier that a majority of Americans are only represented by 18 senators, and a minority of Americans are represented by 82 senators. So the Electoral College is an accurate reflection of the Great Compromise. In the Great Compromise, we decided we're going to represent both population and geography. And with the Electoral College, we are representing both people and geography. Every state has a stake in electing the president that is equal to their stake in both houses of Congress. So it is a very logical compromise. The compromise regarding the Electoral College fits into the logic of the Great Compromise, even though the Electoral College was not, that compromise did not occur at the same time. It actually came a few weeks later. So hopefully, when you take a look at that Electoral College map, for example, my home state of Kentucky has 8 electoral votes. And what that means is that Kentucky has 6 House members and 2 senators. So when I say that the Electoral College makes sense in 1787, that it was a logical compromise given the compromise with the Senate and the House and representing population and geography, that does not necessarily mean that it is the best compromise in 2020. And certainly there have been lots of proposals. But I will tell you honestly that if I am a small state, if I am in a state like Wyoming, or North Dakota, or South Dakota, or Montana, I don't want the Electoral College changed if I'm in a small state because my political power is greater with the Electoral College than it would be with a popular vote. If I am a larger state in population like California, Texas, Florida, New York, I want to abolish the Electoral College because I want my people to make the selection of the president. So it's intriguing this notion about whether we should keep or abolish the Electoral College probably comes down to whether you live in a larger or in a smaller state in terms of what your self-interest happens to be. In the 5 minutes that I have left in this mini lecture, I want to move over to the arena of slavery. And I just want to make some overview points about slavery. Slavery is, in my mind, an immoral, a repugnant practice. It is a practice that's been used virtually all over the world. We've enslaved people who look a lot like us and people who look very differently from us. We've enslaved people for military conquest, for religious persecution, for economic exploitation, and for other factors. Slavery has varied depending on the society in which it's been practiced. For example, in my introduction to political science class, my political science 2000 class, when I talk about slavery in ancient Greece, slaves had far more rights than in the American South, for example. For example, in ancient Athens, a master could not beat a slave, or that slave could be taken away from the master by the state. In ancient Athens, there were many slaves that worked for the state. And try to imagine this in the American South. There were slaves in ancient Greece that served as policemen, as jailers, as governmental bureaucrats who, for example, worked on paperwork, for example. And so we have a situation where slaves had certain rights. They weren't citizens, but they had certain rights. Obviously, in the case of the United States, that is not the case. Now, we tend to think of slavery as a sectional issue, that slavery is something that only existed in the American South, but slavery existed in both the North and the South. Massachusetts had abolished slavery. Pennsylvania kind of had abolished slavery in, I believe, 17. Oh God, I'm going to get the date wrong. Pennsylvania had also banned slavery, but allowed the people who were already slaves to remain slaves. So, in other words, there were no new slaves allowed. The point is that in 1787, slavery was an American issue. It existed in both northern and southern states. Now, obviously, after the Constitution was ratified and signed, slavery was quickly abolished in the northern states. For example, by 1804, every northern state had abolished slavery. And so we end up with a political system where we have northern free states and southern slave states. But I point out that slavery was an American thing because one of the most often questions that I've been asked over my years of teaching is that, well, why didn't northern delegates fight harder for the abolition of slavery? And the answer is it's kind of tough. For example, if I am a delegate from New York and I'm telling Virginia or South Carolina to consider abolishing slavery, they're going to turn around to me and say, well, slavery is still legal in New York. You just have fewer slaves than me. Fix your own house and then come back and talk to us later. And so Northerners were in kind of a tough spot when it came to the issue of slavery. And unfortunately, if you scroll ahead, and I'll talk about slavery in the next lecture, a couple of things may surprise you. Only 15 of the 55 delegates at the Constitutional Convention were slave owners. And unfortunately, in my opinion, neither side cares a lot about the slaves, and both Northerners and Southerners try to exploit slavery to maximize their political power. And I will talk about this in the next mini lecture, Hope you're having a great day.